Welcome to the deep dive. This time, we're going to be taking a deep dive into the world of meta-analysis, specifically in the organizational sciences.
Okay.
And meta-analysis, it's kind of the gold standard these days, right, for combining research findings.
Yeah, absolutely.
Trying to get the bigger picture.
Yeah.
But turns out even that has its share of myths and urban legends.
Yeah, and I think it makes sense too, right? I mean, meta-analysis has just exploded in recent years. I mean, thousands and thousands of articles.
Absolutely. And you know what happens when something gets that popular? Misunderstandings pop up all over the place, like weeds.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's where this paper that we're talking about today by
Guinness, yeah.
colleagues comes in.
Yeah.
They're like the mythbusters of meta-analysis.
Yeah, they really do a great job. I think what's so interesting about this paper is they call out some of the oversimplifications that we tend to make. Like thinking that a single number the average effect is going to tell you the whole story.
You mean like those headlines you see all the time?
Exactly.
Study proves X increases productivity by 10%. Like, is it really ever that straightforward?
I wish it were that simple.
Right.
The problem is focusing just on that average misses all these really important nuances.
Okay.
And it's important to remember that meta-analysis really has these two big goals. One is to figure out what the average is.
Okay.
But the other is to understand how much that effect varies depending on the situation.
Oh, so it's not just about the what. It's also about the when and the why.
The when, the why, the who, all of those things, right?
Gotcha.
So, think about it this way. Imagine a meta-analysis about the impact of different leadership styles on team performance. The average effect might be positive for, a certain leadership style, but hidden within that average could be these huge differences.
Oh.
Right. So maybe that leadership style works great for creative teams, but totally backfires if you have a team that's really analytical.
So it's kind of like assuming everyone's going to like the same pizza toppings, even though some people just hate pineapple.
Perfect analogy, right? Like we need to know what works for who, not just what works on average.
It's myth busted.
There we go.
So what's the next meta-analysis myth we're tackling?
This one is a classic. It's this belief that meta-analysis is this magical process that you can take a pile of flawed studies and turn them into these rock-solid conclusions. Can you really polish a lemon into a shiny apple?
So that's what I'm here to find out. Can meta-analysis actually, rescue bad research?
Well, the paper's pretty clear on this. One meta-analysis is not magic.
Okay.
You can't make lemonade out of lemons.
Yeah.
If the original research is just, riddled with problems, the meta-analysis is going to inherit those problems.
That makes sense. Garbage in, garbage out.
Right, exactly. BAT, and this is important, meta-analysis does give us ways to assess and account for those flaws. So it's less about waving a magic wand and more about becoming a research detective.
Ooh, I like that. A research detective. So how do we put on our detective hats when it comes to meta-analysis?
Well, the paper suggests looking for specific, what they call risk factors. Things that can bias results instead of just trying to slap a single quality score.
Right.
On a study, we need to look for red flags. Things like how were participants selected? Was the data collected in a way that might, kind of skew the findings?
So, for example, if a study about a new training program didn't randomly assign people to groups, that would be like a red flag.
Huge red flag.
Because maybe the people who volunteered were already more motivated to learn.
Exactly. That's a potential source of bias that could really distort the results.
Yeah.
So by identifying these red flags, meta-analysis helps us to be, more critical consumers of the evidence.
It's like knowing which clues to prioritize when you're solving a mystery.
Precisely. And that brings us to myth number 3, which is all about a particular clue, or rather a red herring. That researchers use to chase the failsafe end. Have you heard of this one?
Vaguely. I think it has something to do with publication bias, right?
Yes.
That tendency for only the exciting positive results to get published.
So the failsafe end was an attempt to estimate how many unpublished null result studies would need to exist to overturn a meta-analysis's findings. So for a while, people thought if you have a high failsafe N, you're in the clear.
So kind of like thinking you're popular because you have a lot of imaginary friends.
That's a brilliant way to put it. The problem is the failsafe N calculation rests on some pretty shaky assumptions. It's not nearly as reliable as people thought.
Okay, so what's a better way to deal with publication bias then? What clues should we be following instead?
The paper recommends a technique called the trim and fill method. Think of it as a way to spot those gaps in the research landscape and get a more accurate picture of what might be missing.
So instead of counting imaginary studies, we're looking for patterns in the published research that suggest that, certain types of studies are underrepresented.
Exactly, by visualizing the data and looking for asymmetry,
Okay.
we can get a much more nuanced understanding of the potential impact of publication bias.
This is making me feel like a research detective already.
Yeah.
And we've only just busted 3 myths.
I know, right?
There's so much more to uncover.
Stay tuned because we've got 4 more myths to debunk, and they get even more interesting. All right, so let's tackle myth number 4.
Bring it on. What's next on our meta-analysis myth-busting adventure?
So this one is all about causality. That holy grail of research proving that A causes B.
Yes, the quest to figure out what causes what. Can meta-analysis really deliver on that promise? I mean, it's combining data from all these different studies.
It's tempting to think so, right? But here's the thing. Most organizational research, and therefore most meta-analyses, are based on observational studies, not those really tightly controlled experiments.
Oh.
Yeah.
But wait, I thought the whole point of meta-analysis was to combine all this data from all these studies to get like a more definitive answer.
It does give us more precise estimates, right? And help us to generalize findings, but it doesn't magically transform the type of data that we're working with.
Right.
So observational studies, they can show us patterns, they can show us relationships, but they can't definitively prove that one thing caused another.
Okay.
There could be other factors that are at play.
So if I'm reading a meta-analysis and it says study shows employee recognition programs lead to higher retention rates, I shouldn't assume it's a done deal.
Exactly. It might be that other factors like, a supportive company culture or great leadership are driving both recognition and de-retention.
Gotcha.
So it's like detective work, right? We need more evidence to piece together the full picture.
So where does that leave us? Is meta-analysis kind of useless then when it comes to understanding cause and effect?
Not at all. It's just important to be realistic about what it can and cannot tell us. Think of it as a powerful clue, not the final verdict.
Okay, so it can give us some hints about causality.
Right.
What kind of hints are we talking about?
Well, for one thing, meta-analysis can help us to figure out which causal direction is more likely by comparing different models.
So, for example, with the recognition and retention example, we could compare like how strongly recognition programs are linked to retention rates versus how strongly retention rates are linked to recognition programs.
Exactly. If we see a much stronger link going from recognition programs TO retention, that gives us more confidence that it's the programs that are influencing retention rather than the other way around.
It's kind of like following the footprints to see which direction someone was walking.
That's a great way to put it. Another thing that meta-analysis can do is check if a relationship holds up consistently across different contexts and time periods.
So if we see the same link between recognition and retention popping up across different industries, company sizes, different years, that strengthens the case for a causal relationship.
So consistency is key.
Yeah.
It's like if you see the same footprints appearing in different locations and at different times, it's more likely it's the same person making them.
Precisely. All right, myth busted.
There we go.
Meta-analysis can be a valuable tool for understanding causality, but it's not a magic bullet.
Right.
We still need to think critically and consider the limitations of the underlying research.
Speaking of limitations, what about the idea that meta-analysis with its massive data sets is always like a statistical powerhouse? That's myth number 5, right?
You got it. It's tempting to think that just because we're combining data from, tons of studies, that will automatically have enough statistical power to detect, even the smallest effects.
Right, like having a giant magnifying glass to examine every little detail.
While a large sample size is definitely helpful.
The paper points out that other factors can really undermine our statistical power. Especially when we're trying to find those moderators, the things that can change the strength or direction of a relationship.
So even with thousands of participants, we might miss those crucial nuances.
It's definitely possible. Things like measurement error, how variables are grouped, and even the number of studies included can all impact our ability to detect moderators.
So it's not just about the size of the data set. It's also about the quality and characteristics of the data itself.
Absolutely. Imagine searching for a tiny specific shell on a vast beach. Even if the beach is huge, if the shell is hidden under layers of sand and seaweed, it's going to be tough to find.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so a massive meta-analysis doesn't guarantee we're going to be able to uncover every little detail.
Right. And that leads us to a really interesting question. What happens when a meta-analysis seems to contradict the findings of a single well-designed study?
Oh, this sounds juicy. Especially considering that those randomized controlled trials,
Yeah.
the RCTs, are often seen as like the gold standard in research.
Myth number 6 is all about this belief that if an RCT and a meta-analysis disagree, the meta-analysis is automatically wrong. Flawed, doomed.
So we should just blindly trust the RCT?
Not so fast. The paper makes a strong case for not dismissing meta-analysis so quickly.
Okay, why not?
Remember, a meta-analysis is synthesizing data from many sources. Its average result might not perfectly match any single study, even a well-designed RCT.
All right.
There could be valid reasons for the discrepancy.
That makes sense. It's like comparing a team's average score to the performance of like one-star player.
Yeah.
They're not always going to line up perfectly.
Exactly. The key is to investigate why those differences exist.
Okay.
Are there moderators at play that explain the difference? Or is it something less interesting, like random variation?
So instead of automatically assuming the meta-analysis is wrong, we need to dig deeper and see if there's a good explanation for the difference.
Precisely. And that's where the real detective work of meta-analysis comes in, right? We need to look at the nuances of the data. Consider the limitations of both the meta-analysis and the RCT, and look for clues that help us make sense of the findings.
Okay, so it's not a simple case of declaring a winner.
Right.
We need to be more thoughtful and critical in our interpretations.
All right, ready for our final myth?
Bring it on. What's the last meta-analysis myth we need to bust? All right, lay it on me. What's the final myth that we need to debunk?
This last one is all about the allure of the new and shiny.
Okay.
This belief that, every little tweak or refinement in meta-analysis techniques is some groundbreaking revolution.
It's like thinking every software update on your phone is going to completely change your life.
Exactly. But Guinness and colleagues remind us to be a bit more skeptical.
Okay.
Some of these refinements might only lead to very small changes in the results.
Okay.
Changes that are statistically significant, maybe, but practically meaningless.
So just because something is statistically significant doesn't mean it actually matters out in the real world.
Right. Think about it like this. Imagine you shaved a few seconds off of your commute time.
Okay.
Technically, that's a change, but does it really make a difference in your day?
Not really.
Right.
So how do we know which refinements are actually worth getting excited about?
That's where judgment and context come in. And Guinness and his colleagues, they actually did this huge study.
Okay.
They looked at 196 published meta-analyses to see how much those, methodological choices really impacted the findings.
Wow, that's meta-analysis on meta-analysis.
Right.
Okay, so what did they discover?
Well, their findings were pretty interesting. A lot of those judgment calls and refinements had a surprisingly small impact on the overall effect sizes. It's a good reminder not to get lost in the statistical weeds and to focus on the big picture.
So these fancy new techniques might make our estimates, a tiny bit more accurate,
Yeah.
but they're not necessarily going to revolutionize our understanding.
Exactly. It's like polishing a diamond. It might sparkle a little bit brighter, but it's still fundamentally the same diamond.
Okay, so we've officially busted all 7 meta-analysis myths.
We did it.
What are the key takeaways that you want our listener to walk away with today?
I think the biggest takeaway is that meta-analysis is a really powerful tool, but it's not magic.
Right.
We need to be aware of its limitations, just like with any research method.
Okay.
So don't just blindly accept the findings at face value. Think critically.
So remember, one single number doesn't tell the whole story.
Right.
We need to consider the variability, the potential moderators, all those things that can influence the results.
And don't get seduced by those bold claims about causality.
Right.
A strong relationship doesn't automatically mean causation. Think back to our detective analogy. Meta-analysis gives us clues, but it doesn't solve the case on its own.
Right. And lastly, well, it's great to geek out over, new statistical techniques. We need to keep our eyes on the prize, those big picture insights.
Yeah.
A fancy new method doesn't always translate to a groundbreaking discovery.
Nope.
So to our listener, the next time you come across a headline about some amazing new meta-analysis, remember the myths that we've busted today.
Yeah.
Ask yourself, are they showing me the whole picture?
Think critically, question those assumptions, and don't be afraid to dig a little deeper.
Knowledge is power, And now you have the power to be a more informed and discerning consumer of research. Thanks for joining us on this myth-busting deep dive.